Hi everyone, I'm Bubbles from Susan's family. Today, I'm bringing you a scarf from our retro nostalgia series, the Imprint wool scarf. This scarf consists of the main part and a lining. We start by knitting the main part, and then sew on the lining. It's worth noting that, due to different knit tensions, the size of the fabric pieces can vary. Before we start knitting, you can make a gauge sample to measure your hand tension. The method for making a gauge sample is explained in a separate video. After measuring, follow the instructions in the video to adjust your tension before knitting. Now, let's take a look at the chart. Each square on the chart represents one stitch. Each square corresponds to one loop when knitting. Different colored squares correspond to different colors of yarn. Here, the blank squares represent knit stitches. A horizontal line represents a purl stitch. Decrease stitches also occupy one square. This area indicates the cast-on method and the number of chains. When counting the number of stitches in each row, just count the number of squares. Then match this with the number of loops on the needle. Arrows indicate the direction of knitting. The right side is always read from right to left in the chart. The wrong side is read from left to right in the chart. Pay attention to the wrong side knitting. You need to work the opposite stitches as shown in the chart. This is the basic introduction to the chart. The final chart should be based on the one you have in hand. Let's start by learning how to knit the main part. It is divided into the ribbing edge and the pattern area. Start by knitting the ribbing edge. Use the alternate knit and purl stitch method to cast on. Knit the single ribbing back and forth. After casting on is complete, alternate between 2 knit stitches and 2 purl stitches. This forms the 2x2 ribbing. Here's how to transition from single ribbing after casting on to knitting the 2x2 ribbing. First, learn the method, and then follow the chart to knit. Start with 1 purl stitch, followed by 1 knit stitch, alternating. Make a slip knot with the yarn. Leave a long tail for the yarn end. This makes it easier to weave in the ends later. Hold the corresponding circular needle in your left hand. The circular needle has 2 points. You can use one of the points to knit directly. Insert the needle into the loop. Slightly tighten it. This is the first stitch. This stitch will be a purl stitch. Hold the other point of the knitting needle in your right hand as if you were holding a pen. Then, take the end of the yarn around your little finger. Gently pinch the yarn with your ring finger and middle finger. Place the yarn between your index finger and middle finger. This is the proper posture for knitting with straight needles. Next, place the right needle above the yarn. Insert it downwards into the loop on the left needle. Use your right index finger to pick up the yarn. Yarn over. Draw the yarn through. Slip it onto the left needle. Don't pull the yarn too tight, otherwise, it will be difficult to pick up the stitches later. This is the second stitch. This stitch is a knit stitch. You can see that the yarn is below. Start the purl stitch by making a starting chain. Place the right needle underneath the yarn. Insert it upwards through the space between these 2 loops. Pay attention to the middle position of the loops. Don't pull through the loops. Yarn over. Pick the yarn out. Slip it onto the left needle. This is the third stitch. This stitch is a purl stitch. You can see that the yarn is above. Continue with the knit stitch starting chain. Place the right needle above the yarn. Insert the needle. yarn over, pick
挑
out.
出，
This
这
is
是
the
第
fourth
4针，
stitch. Make
在这
one
一
more
针上
purl
针的
stitch
起
starting
针，
chain.
右半
Place the
针
right
放在
needle
线
below
的
the
下
yarn.
方，穿入半
Insert the
针，
needle.
绕
Yarn
线，
over, pick
挑
out.
出。 这
This
是
is the
第5
fifth
针，
stitch. The
起针就
starting
是按
chain is
照
done by making one purl
一
stitch,
针上针，一
one
针
knit
下针，
stitch,
交替
alternate
向
and
下
knit
编织。
downwards. If the
线
yarn
头
tail
在
is
上
above,
方，就织
start with
下
a
针
knit
的起
stitch.
针。
If the
线头
yarn
在
tail is
下方，
below,
就织
start
上针
with a
的
purl
起针。
stitch.
往
Knit
下
down to the
织到需
required
要的
number
针
of
数，
stitches. After
写完需要
casting
的
on the
针数
required
后，
number
起
of
针就完
stitches,
成
the
了。
casting on
我
is
想让这里
complete.
针
My
数又较
sample
少，
has fewer stitches. When the
实
actual
际起
number
针
of
数
stitches is
较多
larger,
时，大家注意
everyone
核
should
对
check
针
the
数。
number of stitches. Then start
接着
working row
织第
1.
1行，图
The
解
first
第
stitch
1
in the
针
pattern
是下
chart
针
is
符
a knit
号，对
symbol.
应编织下针。
Correspondingly, knit a stitch. The
线
yarn is
在针
below
的
the
下
needle.
方，右半
Insert
针
the right
从
straight
上往
needle
下
from top
穿
to
入左
bottom
半针
into the
的第
first
一个
loop on the
线
left
圈。
straight needle.
注意
Note that
是
you are
穿入线
inserting into the
圈，
loop,
不
not
要穿
between
到
the
线圈之
loops.
间。
Then,
然
with
后
your
右
right
手带
hand,
线，
bring the yarn,
绕
yarn
线，
over, pick
挑
out,
出，
release
开
the
左
loop on
半
the
针
left
的线
straight
圈。
needle.
这
That
样一针
completes
下
one
针
knit
就织好
stitch.
了。 织完
After
下
knitting,
方
you will see a
是一
braid-like
个
texture below.
辫子形状的纹理，这
This
是
is
下
the
针的
texture
纹
of a
理。
knit stitch.
往下继
Continue
续，
downward. The
第二
second
针仍然
stitch is
是
also
下
a
针符
knit
号，
symbol.
对应织一针下
Correspondingly,
针。
knit one stitch. At this
此
point,
线圈
the
靠
loop is
后
behind.
为上
This
针
is
的
the
线
loop for a
圈，
purl stitch.
同
There
时
is
有
also
线
a
横
strand
在
of
当前
yarn
线圈
above the
的上
current
方。
loop. The
后面一
next
针
loop
线
is in
圈靠
front.
前，这
This
是
is
下
the
针
loop
的
for a
线
knit
圈，
stitch.
则
So
我
we
们
need
需
to
要与
swap the
后面
positions
的
of
一
these two
针交换
loops.
一下位置。
With
右
your
手
right
捏
hand,
住
pinch the
左半
bottom of
针
the
的
two
两
loops
个
on the
线
left
圈底
straight
部，
needle.
然
Then,
后
release these
左
two
半
loops
针
from the
放
left
开这
straight
两个线
needle.
圈。
First,
先将
bring the
上针
purl
的
loop
线
back
圈
onto the
在
left
后
straight
方
needle
穿
from
回左半
behind.
针上。 再
Then
将下
return the
针
knit
的线
stitch
圈
loop to
在
the
前
left
方
needle
穿
in
回左
front.
半针上。
Now the
此时
two
两个
loops
线
have
圈交
swapped
换好了位
positions.
置。这里
Here,
下
the
针
knit
的线
stitch
圈
loop
在
is in
前方。
front.
完
After
成后
completing
织一
it,
针
work
下
one
针，
knit stitch.
穿入
Insert,
绕
yarn
线
over
挑
and
出，
draw through.
放
Release
开
the
线
loop.
圈，完成
Complete
下
the knit
针。
stitch.
后
The
面
next
两针
two
是上
symbols
针
are
符
for
号，
purl
对应
stitches.
织两针上针。
Correspondingly, work
这
two
里刚
purl
好是连
stitches.
续的
Here,
两
you
针上
have
针
two
线圈，
consecutive
直
purl
接编
stitch
织即
loops.
可。
You can work them directly.
将
Wrap the
线绕
yarn
到
above
针
the
的上
needle.
方，右
Insert the
半
right
针从
knitting
下
needle
往
from the
上，
bottom up into the loop
穿
on the
入
left
左半
knitting
针的
needle.
线圈，
Yarn
绕
over,
线，挑
pick up,
出，放开
release the
左半
loop on
针
the
的
left
线
knitting
圈，
needle. Complete
完
one
成一
purl
针上
stitch.
针。
The
有
texture
一
with a
根线
strand of yarn
横
running
在
above
线
the
圈
loop.
上方的这种纹理，就
Is
是
the
上
purl
针纹
stitch
理。
texture?
继
Continue.
续，线
Keep the
仍然
yarn
放在
above the
针的
needle.
上方，穿
Insert
入
into
线
the loop.
圈， 绕
Yarn
线
over and draw through.
挑出，放开
Release the loop.
线圈，又完
Another
成
purl
一针
stitch
上
is
针。
completed. The
完
next
下
two
两针
stitches
是
are
下
knit
针符号，
symbols.
先正常
First,
织一
knit
针下
one
针。
stitch normally.
注
Pay
意上
attention
针
when
换下
switching
针
from a
时，
purl
线
to a
要
knit
换下来，
stitch. The yarn should be
并
dropped
编织。
down. Match the knitting. After
完成后，往
completing,
下两个
swap the
线圈，
positions of the
交
next
换
two
一下位
loops.
置。
The knit
下
stitch
针的
loop
线
is in
圈
front.
在前，
You
这
can
里
use a
使用
straight
半
needle
针
to
辅
help
助
with the
交换。
exchange.
先将
First,
两个
move the
线
two
圈移
loops
到
to the
右
right
半针
needle.
上，然后
Then,
左半
pick up
针
the
在
first
后
loop
翻，
from
挑
behind with the
起
left
第一个
needle.
线圈，放
Release
开
the
线
loop.
圈，右半
Pick up
针
the
挑
second
起
loop
第
with
二
the
个
right
线
needle.
圈，
Move
移
it
到
to the
左
left
半针
needle.
上，
The loops
线
are
圈
now
就交换好
exchanged.
了。然
Then
后
knit
织一针
one
下针，
stitch,
后
followed
面织
by
两
two
针
purl
上针。
stitches. Continue
继续按
backward
照
with two
两
knit
针下
stitches,
针、两
then
针
two
上针
purl
交替
stitches
编织。
alternating.
编织
During the
过程
knitting
中注意
process,
交
pay
换
attention
上
to
下针
exchanging
线
the
圈位
positions
置，
of the knit and
保
purl
证在
loops.
下针
Ensure
线
you
圈
knit into
上
the knit
织下
stitch
针。
loops.
在
And
上
purl
针
into
线
the
圈
purl
织
stitch
上
loops.
针。 按照这
Repeat
样的
this
方法，将
process
剩余
until
针数
all
织完。
remaining stitches are completed. After
织完最后
finishing
一
the
针，
last stitch,
稍
gently
拉
pull
紧
to
起针
tighten
的
the
线
starting
头。
tail. At
此
this
时
point,
第一
the
行
first
就
row
完
is
成了。
done.
这
This
一
row
行
is
是
the
整
right
个织
side of the
片的正
fabric
面，
piece. The
起针
starting
的线
tail
头
is on the
在
left
左侧。
side.
接着
Next,
织
work
第
the
二行，
second row.
这一
We
行
will
在
work
反
this
面
row
编
on the
织，
wrong
需要
side.
编织
You
与
need
图
to
解
knit
相
the
反的
opposite
针法。
stitches from the
先
chart.
翻面，
First, turn the work. The
开始
first two
两针，
stitches in the
图解
chart
是
are
下
knit
针符号，
symbols.
相反
So,
针法
you will
编
purl
织上
these two
针，
stitches.
则织两
Therefore,
针上
work
针。
two purl stitches. The
后面
next
两
two
针是
stitches
上
are
针符
purl
号，
symbols.
相反针法
So,
编织
you will
下
knit
针，
these two
对应织
stitches.
下针。
Correspondingly, you will knit. Moving
然后大家
forward,
除了对照
besides
图解，
referring to the
还可以
chart,
参照
you
纹
can
理
also
进行
follow
编
the
织。
texture for your
遇
stitching. When
到
you encounter a purl
上针纹
texture,
理，对应编织上
correspondingly,
针。
you will purl. When
遇到
you
下针
encounter
纹
a
理，
knit texture,
对应编织下
correspondingly,
针。
you will knit. For
这一
this
行仍
row,
然
you will
是交
still
替编
alternate
织
two
两
purl
针上
stitches
针
and two
和
knit
两针
stitches.
下针，将这
Finish
一
this
行织完。
row. Complete the last stitch. The
第二行
second
完
row
成。
is done.
往
For the
后剩余
remaining
行
rows,
就是
you will
编
be
织这
working
样
the
的
2
双
by
螺
2
纹，
ribbing.
每
Each
行都
row will
是
alternate two knit stitches
两针
and
下
two
针
purl
和两针
stitches.
上针交替。
The order of
上下针的
knit
先
and
后
purl
顺序
stitches
参考
should be
图纸
based
或
on the
者文
chart
例。
or the texture.
注意
Note that odd numbered rows
单
are
数
worked
行
on the
在
right
正面编
side.
织，直接
Just
编
follow
织
the
图解
stitch
对应
pattern
的
as
针法
shown in
即
the
可。
chart.
双数
Even
行在
numbered
反
rows
面
are
编
worked
织，
on the
需
wrong
要编织
side.
与图
You will
解
need to
相反
work
的
the
针法。
opposite stitch
这
pattern
就
from the
是双
chart.
螺纹
This
的
is the
编织方
method for
法。
working the 2 by
螺纹编
2
织好
ribbing.
后，
After
接着来
completing the
编织
ribbing
花样
edge,
区
we
域。
will move on to the pattern
两边
area.
需要
On
编
both
织搓衣
sides,
板针
you
花
will work
样，
the seed
也就
stitch
是
pattern,
一
which
行下针
alternates
和一
between
行
one
上
row of
针
knit
交替编
stitches
织。
and
同
one
样
row of
反
purl
面编织
stitches.
与图解相
Similarly,
反的
on
针
the
法。
wrong side,
第一
you
行
will work
还
the
需要
opposite
编织
stitch
左上
pattern
两
from the
针第一
chart.
针，
In the first row,
中间
you
位
also
置
need to
都
work
编织
K2
下针，
tog, knit 2
且需要
together.
编
In the
织
middle
提花，
position,
也就
you will
是
work
需要
knit
重新接
stitches,
线。
and you need
编
to
织过
work
程中需
intarsia,
要进
which
行带
means you
线
will need
及
to
压
join a
线。
new yarn. During the knitting process,
下面
you
分
need to
别给
carry
大
and
家
press
提
the
供
yarn.
左上
Below,
两
I
针
will
并针的
provide you
编织
with
方
the
法
method for
和接
working
线以
K2
及带
tog,
线压
knit
线的
2
方法。
together, and the
先学习
methods
方
for
法，
joining
再
yarn
对
and
照图纸的
carrying
针法
and
编织。
pressing the yarn. First, learn the
下针
methods,
左上
then
两针
follow
并
the
针，
chart to work
简
the
称
stitch
下针
patterns.
左上
Knit
并针。
stitch K2 tog,
编织
knit 2
时，
together,
右
which
针
is abbreviated as
从
left
左
upper
往右，
cluster.
同
When
时穿
working,
过
insert the
这
right
两个
needle
线
from
圈。
left to right, pass through both of these loops. Work
织
one
一个
knit
下针，
stitch. That
这样
completes the left
下
upper
针左上并
cluster.
针就完成了。
You can
可
see
以发
that
现，左
the
侧
left
线
loop
圈
is above the right loop.
在右侧线圈上方。
Let me
我再演示
demonstrate
一
it
次。
again. Insert
从
the
左
needle
往
from
右
left to
穿
right
入
through
这
these
两
two
个线
loops
圈，织
and
一个
work
下针
one
即
knit
可。
stitch. This
这
is
个
how
就
you
是
work the
下
left
针左
upper
上并针的
cluster.
织法。
Stranded color work.
这里
Here
我
I'll
用小
demonstrate
暗
with a
示
small
先
sample.
织
First,
正面的一
work a
行
row on the
从右
right
往左
side.
看图
Read the
解
chart from right to
需要
left.
用
You
两
need to
种颜
use
色
two
编
colors
织
for this. The different
桌子中
colored
不同
squares in the
颜色格
chart
子对应不同
correspond to
颜色的
different
线
colored yarns.
需要
Refer
参
to
考
the
图纸
chart
使
and
用
use the
对应颜色编
corresponding
织
colors.
先
Start
接
by
线
joining the
我们
yarn.
将
We'll call
连
the
线
original
成为
yarn
线
color
1
1. The
牵
new
线
yarn will
成
be
为线
called
2
color 2.
将
Tie the two
两根
yarns
线
together.
结
Then
然
pull
后
the
将
knot to the
线
base.
拉至根部
Whenever
以后
you
遇
need
到
to
需
join
要接
yarn
线
in
的
the
情况
future,
就参
refer
考
to
自
this
己的演示知道
demonstration. Then
然后
follow the
对照
chart
图纸
and use the
使用对
corresponding
应颜色
colors.
线编织
Here,
这里我
I'll
先演示一
demonstrate
下
changing
每
colors
边
on
用
every
暗色的
stitch.
情况
First,
这里
I'll
我
use
先用
color
线
1 to
1
work one knit
织一
stitch.
针下针
Then,
然后
I'll hold
用
both
一只
yarns
手
with one
绑
hand.
两根线
Wrap
分
the
别
yarn with your
用
pinky
小
and
拇
ring
指
finger.
和无名指绕线 这
This
样
way,
两根
each of
手
the
指
two
上分
fingers
别
holds
绕两
one
根线
yarn.
继
Continue
续
using
用
color
线
2
2
to
织
work
一
one
针
stitch. Pick up the
从
yarn
线
from
1
below
下
color
方挑
1.
线 换
After
线转
switching
一针
colors
后
and
可以
working
看到
one stitch, you can see that
后
there is a
方有一
carrying
根
yarn
线
at the back. Gently
稍微
stretch the
拉伸贴
fabric
片
to make
使
the
肚线
carrying
与
yarn
织片
level with
齐
the
平
fabric.
肚
Don't
线
pull the
不要拉
carrying
太
yarn
紧
too
防
tight
止织
to
品皱
prevent the
缩
fabric from puckering. Continue
继续
working one stitch
将
with color 1.
线一织一针。
Here,
这里
note that
线
color
一
1
注
should
意
be picked
从
up from
上方
above. Pay attention to stretching the fabric.
拉伸织片。
After
完成后
completing this,
继续
continue
从
picking
下
up
方
color
挑
2
线
from
2织一
below
针。
and work 1 stitch.
注意
Note that,
大家
when
挑
picking
线
up the
时
yarn,
确保两根
ensure
线
that the
不
two
要连
yarns
起来。
don't twist together. For the main part. After
每次
switching
换
colors and
线
working
转一
1
针后
stitch,
都要
make
稍微
sure
拉
to
伸织
slightly
片，
stretch the fabric.
确
Ensure
保
the
织片
fabric
平
is
整，
flat.
也
This
就是
means the
你的
carrying
动线
yarn should
不
not
要
be
拉太
pulled
紧。
too tight. Continue
继续
knitting.
编织，
Work
线
color
一
1 from
从
above.
上方编织，
Pull
线
color
二
2 from
从下
below.
方拉线，
If using only your index finger is
全部用食
inconvenient,
指时不方便，可
you
以
can use your middle
在
finger to
线
pick
二
up
编
color
织时
2.
用中指挑线。
After
完成
completing
后可以
this,
看一下，
you can take a look. The
线
carrying
页
yarn
动
for
线
color
停
1
在
will be
上
on
方，
top. The
线二
carrying
动
yarn
线
for
停
color
在
2
下
will be
方。
on the
管
bottom.
理
The
美观，
texture
线
will
不
look
会乱。
neat, and the
实际
yarn
大
won't
家也可
tangle.
以不
In
分上
practice,
下，
you
管
don't
理
have
美
to
观即可。
strictly separate the
这
top
个
and
就是
bottom, as
每
long
针
as the
都换
right
线的
side
情
looks
况。
nice.
接
This
下
is the
来同一
situation
根
where you
线
switch
连续
colors
编
for
织
every
超过
stitch.
4针式。
Next, when the
同
same
样可
color
以
is
按
used
照
for
对
no
的
more
演
than
示
4
编织。
stitches in a row, you can follow the demonstration here. The specific number of stitches for each color. Pay attention to following the chart. Don't knit wrong. If you exceed 4 stitches, you need to carry the other yarn.
进行带线处理。
Here, I'll demonstrate the method, the technique for carrying the yarn when knitting 5 stitches in a row. First, switch colors and knit 3 stitches. Then, use your index finger to pick up the other yarn. Pull the yarn through from below. Continue knitting 1 stitch with this yarn.
织一针下针。
The other yarn has now been carried once. The carried yarn should also be level with the fabric piece. Ensure the fabric piece remains flat. Continue knitting 1 more stitch. This way, the 5 consecutive stitches are finished. This is the method for carrying the yarn. After each time you carry the yarn, gently stretch the fabric piece. When carrying the yarn, you always carry it after every 3 stitches. I'll demonstrate carrying the yarn again while knitting 7 consecutive stitches. Pay attention each time you pick up the yarn, ensuring that the 2 strands don't twist together. Here, pick up the yarn from underneath and knit 3 stitches. Then, from underneath the other strand, pick up this strand and knit 3 more stitches. After each time you carry the yarn, gently stretch the fabric piece. Because of the carried yarn, the 2 strands will twist together. When you continue knitting, pay attention to keeping them separate. Continue by carrying the yarn and knitting 1 stitch. This completes the 7 consecutive stitches. If you have more consecutive stitches later, carry the yarn a few more times. The method is the same as before. You can see that, here, the yarn was carried twice. Next, refer to the demonstration here. Keep knitting until the second to last stitch of this row. After finishing the second to last stitch, when you knit the last stitch, regardless of the number of intervals, carry color 2 once. This completes the explanation for the right side of the row. Continue knitting the wrong side of the row. On the wrong side, always follow the chart from left to right, and the chart represents the right side of the fabric. So on the wrong side, we should work a wrong side definition of the symbols. Therefore, this row should all be made in purl stitches. Hold the yarn with your right hand and place the needle under both strands of yarn. Use the corresponding yarn to work 1 purl stitch. Pay attention to gently stretch the fabric, ensuring that you don't pull the fabric too tight. Then, normally pick up the corresponding yarn and work a purl stitch. When picking up and working the stitch, make sure the two strands of yarn do not twist together. When working on the wrong side. After each color change and completing one stitch, gently stretch the fabric immediately. Ensure the fabric stays flat. If the number of consecutive stitches does not exceed 4. Follow this method for changing colors and working the stitches. If it exceeds 4 stitches, you still need to carry the yarn. The method is the same as when working on the right side. Here, I'll demonstrate the method for carrying the yarn over 7 consecutive stitches. First, work 3 stitches. Carry the yarn once, then work 3 more stitches. Carry the yarn again, and work 1 more stitch. This completes the 7 consecutive stitches, with the yarn carried twice. Next, everyone can refer to this demonstration and follow the chart. Continue working until the second to last stitch of the row. Pay attention to the layers of the 2 yarns, keeping them as consistent as possible with the ones below.
尽量与下方保持一致。
One yarn should always be on top, and the other should always be on the bottom. This makes the texture more attractive. When you reach the corresponding position, you can also carry the other yarn when working the last stitch. This completes the explanation of the row on the wrong side. This is the method for intarsia knitting in flat pieces. This concludes the explanation of the pattern area. Once the entire pattern area is finished, finally, you need to knit the ribbing. The method is almost the same as at the beginning. However, here you need to work the right side increase. After completing it, perform the 2 times 2 ribbing bind off. Below, I will provide the methods for the right side increase and the 2 times 2 ribbing bind off. First, learn the methods. Then follow the chart to knit. Start by learning the right side increase for the knit stitch. Usually, the loops below are the braid. First, pick the right side strand of the braid. Knit 1 stitch. This is the added stitch. Then, continue to insert the hook into the loop of this stitch. Knit 1 stitch. This completes the right side increase for the knit stitch. You can see that 2 loops are created within 1 braid. I'll demonstrate it again. First,
先
pick the
挑下
right
方
side strand of the braid below
辫
and
子
knit one
右侧一
stitch.
根线，织一个下针，
Then,
然
pick
后
up this loop and knit
挑起
one
这个线
stitch.
圈，再织一个下针即可。
If the loop is
如
below
果
a
线圈
horizontal
下方是
bar,
横线，
pick the
就
right side of the
挑横线
horizontal
的右
bar
侧
and knit a
织下
stitch.
针。
Then, pick
再
up
挑这
this
个线
loop and
圈
knit
织下
one
针即
stitch.
可。
I'll
我再演
demonstrate it
示一
again.
次。 先
First,
挑
pick
横
the
线
right
右侧，
side of the
织一
horizontal
个下
bar
针，
and knit one stitch. Then,
再
pick
挑
up this loop and knit
这个
one
线圈
stitch.
织下针。
That's
以
the
上
method
就
for
是
knitting
下
a
针又
right
加
side
针的编织方
increase.
法。
Start by
先
knitting
织
two
2个
stitches in the
与
opposite texture from the
下
row
方纹理
below.
相反的针法。我这里
Here,
就是
I
织
will
2
knit
个
two
上
purl
针，
stitches.
然后
Then,
将
bring
前
the
一针
first
带过
stitch
后
over
一
the
针，
second stitch.
接着
Next,
捏住
pinch the
线圈
bottom
底
of the
部，
loop
将
and
针
insert
从
the
底
needle
线的
from
上
above the
方，
yarn back into the loop.
再穿回线圈，也
This
就是变
changes
换
the
了线的
position of
位
the
置。
yarn.
织一
Knit
针
one
与下
stitch in
方
the
纹理
opposite
相反的针
texture
法，
from the row
也就是
below.
织一
In
个
other
下针，
words, knit one stitch. Bind
收一
off
针，
one stitch. For
后
the
面
rest, you
都
will knit
是
in the
要
opposite
织与
texture to
下方
bind
纹理
off.
相反的针法进行收针。织
When
下
knitting
针
the
时
stitch,
要保
make
证
sure the yarn is
线在
below the
针的下
needle.
方，因此
Therefore,
这里
keep the
线不
yarn in
动，
place
继
and
续织一个
continue to
下
knit
针，
one stitch.
收
Bind
一
off
针，
one stitch. The
下一
next
针要
stitch
织
should
上
be a
针。
purl stitch.
这里
Here,
要
you
变
need to
换线的
change
位
the
置，
position of the
确保
yarn.
织上针
Ensure that
前
before you
线
purl, the
在针的
yarn
上
is above
方。
the needle. Bind
收一
off
针，
one stitch. Continue to
织一个
purl
上
one
针，
stitch and bind off.
收针。 按照这
Repeat
样的
this
方法
process
继续
and
收针。
continue binding off. If you
边缘
can't
一
see
针
the
如果
texture
看不
below
清
the
下
edge
方纹
stitch
理，就
clearly,
可以
you
不
don't
变
need
换
to
线的
change
位
the
置。
position of the
线在下
yarn.
方
If
就
the
织
yarn
下
is
针，
below,
线
knit
在上
one
方就织
stitch.
上
If the
针。
yarn is
我
above,
这里边
purl
缘一
one
针，
stitch.
下方是
In
下
my
头纹
case,
理，
the texture below
织
the
上针
edge
收
stitch
掉。
is a knit stitch, so I will purl and bind off. Finally, leave a long yarn tail for sewing. The yarn tail should not exceed 1 meter. Longer tails can make sewing inconvenient. If
如
it's
果
not
不
enough,
够，中
pick
途
up new
再重
yarn
新
and
取
sew as
线
needed.
缝。
That's
这样
it. We've
收针
covered
就
binding
讲完了。
off. Once
全
everything
部
is
完成
completed,
后，
tuck in the
将
yarn
线头
tails
顺
along
着
the
反面
texture
的
on
纹
the
理收
wrong
好。
side.
这
Here,
里我用
I'll
了小样演
demonstrate with
示。
a small sample. Up to this point, we've covered the main part. Now, let's sew the lining. Sew it on the wrong side of the main part. Before sewing, press the wrong side of the fabric piece to make it flat. Then, complete the sewing. Place the smooth side of the lining against the wrong side of the fabric piece. Below, I'll demonstrate the method of sewing with a small sample. Place the lining fabric over the fabric piece. In practice, your fabric pieces will be larger. To make sewing easier, you can use pins to secure it well. If you don't have pins, you can use safety pins as an alternative. You can choose multiple positions to secure it. After securing, trim the lining according to the dimensions specified in the pattern. You can also trim based on the actual situation. The lining fabric should extend about 3-4 centimeters around the edges of the fabric piece. Then, sew along the edge. Cut a long piece of sewing thread. Thread the needle. Then, secure the end of the thread on the fabric piece. You can secure it a few times for extra hold. Fold the lining along the edge towards the inside. After folding, align it roughly with the edge. Then, insert the needle through both the fabric piece and the lining. Try to avoid visible stitches on the right side while sewing. When sewing later, if the thread isn't long enough, you can tie a knot and hide the tail on the fabric piece. Then, take another piece of thread and thread the needle. Secure the end of the new thread and continue sewing. When you reach the corner, fold the next edge inward. Continue
继
sewing.
续缝合。
When you have 2
还
sides
剩2
left,
条边时，
if the
如果两
excess
边多出
lining
的
is
内
too
衬比较
long,
长，大
you
家
can
可以
trim
根
it
据
down
喜
according
好
to your
再修剪
preference.
掉一部分。
Continue
继续把
sewing the
内衬
lining
缝
until
完。
it's complete. After
缝好
sewing,
后打结
tie
长
off
线。
and hide the tail. Finally,
最后将
remove
珠
all
针
the
都取
pins.
下。
That's it for
这样
sewing
内
the
衬就
lining.
缝完了。
Up
这
to
里
this
这款围
point,
巾
we've
就全
covered
部讲完
everything
了。
about this
如果
scarf.
大家
If you
在
have
编织
any
过程
unclear
中
parts
也
during
有
the
不
knitting
清楚的地
process,
方，
don't
可以与
hesitate
我
to
们的
reach
客
us
服联
via our
系。
website,
苏苏姐家一
Susan's
针一
Family.
线，享
Support
受
your
生活乐
handwork
趣。感
experience.
谢大家
Enjoy
的
the
观看，
joy of
我
life.
们下期
Thanks
再
for
见。
watching.